Welcome to the Coolidge at the Greenway. How's everybody doing tonight? It's wonderful to be back. We're doing something a little different here. We're presenting science on screen. Tonight, you're here for the birds in 35 millimeter. The birds was our very first Coolidge at the Greenway program back in 2015. And tonight, we are very pleased to have with us Harvard evolutionary biologist and ornithologist, Dr. Scott Edwards.
So birds have an amazing evolutionary history that goes back 300 million years. What you're seeing behind me is a genealogical tree showing the relationships of birds and a group called amniotes. Amniotes refers to the amniotic egg, and that's the egg that allowed vertebrates to move from the water onto land. The key thing to remember is that birds are reptiles, okay? They're part of a specialized group of reptiles that, of course, evolved feathers and lots of other birdy things. Let's go to the next slide. Thank you. So, going back to deep time, we can think of the eggs of fish and amphibians. They've got to lay their eggs in water. That's how their embryos are sustained. If we go to the next slide, we can see that this was the beginning of a major revolution on land when amniotes developed this egg, which essentially allowed the embryo to remain on land but not become desiccated. There are a variety of layers in this egg. Of course, it's got a hard shell. And of course, we mammals, we humans, are also part of this amniotic group. The uterus is one of the layers that's evolved from the layers inside this egg. And so we're all part of this group that's been able to move onto land from the water. In the next slide, you can see these incredible adaptations that have allowed birds and reptiles to evolve into many, many different habitats across the globe. In the next slide, you can see back in the Triassic, over 200 million years ago, there were major cataclysms that caused extinctions and rearrangements of the continents all over the place. And you can see some of the survivors of that cataclysm going on to the right of this slide. You can see that there's crocodilians and there's some of the ancestors of birds. And you can see that many, many groups went extinct. And so this was the first event that set the stage to give rise to the evolution of birds. In the next slide, I want to take a little vote here. Now, there are three main hypotheses for what groups birds are most closely related to. The first are crocodilians. Everyone knows what a crocodile is, right? There's about 22 species on the planet today. That's the first group. The second group is sort of the reptile, if you will, right at the base of the tree. You can see that in the middle. And then the third group are the dinosaurs. So who votes for the crocodiles as the closest relatives of birds? Anyone out there? Okay, we've got a few. How about the reptile coming from the base of this tree? A few? Okay, how about dinosaurs? Woohoo! All right, you guys have obviously been reading up on your evolutionary history. Now, if we go to the next slide, you can see that this gentleman, Thomas Henry Huxley, was instrumental in promoting this idea of birds evolving from dinosaurs. He was a contemporary of Darwin. And while Darwin after he returned from the Beagle and he was convalescing in his home, it was really Huxley who promoted evolution and some of the great ideas that we're still grappling with today. If you go to the next slide, you can see a picture of the famous museum at Oxford University where Huxley debated whether evolution was actually a real thing or not. And if you click a few slides here, now, if you ever get asked to go to Oxford to lecture about birds, and if they ask you whether you want to stay in the Holiday Inn or one of the quaint Oxford dormitories, choose the Holiday Inn. This was like being in a prison cell for 2 nights. You can see that Huxley's famous quote here, it says, "If then, has said I, the question is put to me, would I rather have a miserable ape for a grandfather or a man highly endowed by nature and possessing great means and influence, and yet who employs those faculties for the mere purpose of introducing ridicule into a grave scientific discussion, I unhesitatingly affirm my preference for the ape." So this was, let's hear it for evolution. I mean, if this COVID pandemic has taught us anything, it's that evolution is happening right before our eyes, right? Okay, in the next slide. Now, Huxley pointed to dinosaurs like Compsognathus, a very light-boned, very gracile dinosaur about the size of a turkey. didn't have wings, but it was a bipedal, which of course birds are. You can see these really long arms, which were used for grasping prey. And it was Huxley who really connected the dots and said these were the ancestors of birds. In the next slide, Archaeopteryx, one of the most amazing fossils ever discovered in the limestone cliffs in Germany. Now, don't be fooled by those products you buy in the stores, Arc'teryx and all those fancy coats. The name is Archaeopteryx. Let's say it all together. Archaeopteryx. Excellent, excellent. Archaeopteryx was probably one of the most important vertebrate fossils ever discovered. It lived about 150 million years ago. It had amazing wing feathers, and we now know it had feathers all over its legs as well. But it had things like teeth, and so it was sort of this hybrid reptile bird. If we go to the next slide, one of the amazing things we've discovered about birds in the last 20 years is that many of the dinosaur ancestors of birds actually had full body coverings of proto-feathers. These were simplified feathers in a way very much like hair, but it was interesting to think that feathers evolved not first for flight, but in fact for probably thermoregulation, keeping dinosaurs warm, and potentially for display. If we go to the next slide, you can see some of the modern depictions of dinosaurs, clearly not flying, but nonetheless covered with feathers. And so, I'm waiting for Jurassic Park to embrace this feather thing. I think the last one didn't have feathers, but I think the latest one might actually have feathers. And we know now that feathers were essentially found in every major dinosaur group. If we go to the next slide, now modern birds, which are the 10,000 or so species that are on the planet today, and I see a lot of great, we're seeing gulls flying over. We have lots of great birds in the Boston area. One big theory is that many of these groups, including the crows, which we'll see lots of in this Hitchcock film, evolved from the southern supercontinent of Gondwana. This, of course, was a major landmass in the southern hemisphere, and many of the oldest fossils we have of modern birds are found in the southern hemisphere. In the next slide, scientists now have an amazing view of bird evolution, not using fossils so much, but using DNA. We know, for example, that modern birds probably originated about 110 million years ago. And so when we hear Hitchcock talk about how birds and humans have had lots of interactions for much of their history, don't be fooled. Birds have been on this planet long, long before humans ever got here. We know that many birds can learn their vocalizations, and of course parrots are a great example of that. But many groups of so-called songbirds, of which crows are a member, they need a tutor to learn their vocalizations. If they've grown up in isolation, they don't learn their vocalizations. And so birds are one of the best models out there for studying how the brain works to learn speech. And we often use birds to understand how humans are learning their speech. In the next slide, we're going to see this incredible movie, and you may have looked online. To make this movie, Hitchcock had to jump through all kinds of hoops. He had to not only get the permits to to manipulate all these birds, but he had to train them in many cases. You'll see crows in there, you'll see seagulls, you'll see all kinds of swifts and sparrows. And, I worry a little bit because, of course, it's this movie which has caused many folks to be afraid of birds for the rest of their life. And, this is not good for the field of ornithology. We need as much new blood as we can get. In the next slide, we can click through a couple of these. Now, crows in particular, they are part of this Gondwanan exodus. And many of the crow-like birds that you see, if you go to Australia, things like this currawong or the magpies, some of these can indeed be fairly ferocious. If you walk past a magpie nest in Canberra, Australia, you better put a hard hat on, because that magpie is going to be dive bombing you, and it can draw blood. I mean, I've been the target of some of these attacks. Of course, it mostly happens during the breeding season when they're naturally wanting to protect their young. And many of the crows that we have in North America, on the next slide, you can keep clicking through. We've got an amazing panoply of crow-like birds, including jays, ravens. We've got the green jay down in Texas. And so this group of crow families is really quite diverse, and as I'm sure you know, one of the most intelligent groups of birds on the planet. The famous New Caledonian crow living on the island of New Caledonia is famous for its use of tools to extract food from complicated places to get access. In the next slide, Australia, again, this wellspring of diversity, and all of these birds here, in fact, are related in one major group that we call an adaptive radiation, coming from a single common ancestor and evolving into more than 500 species of these songbirds. Things like honeyeaters, babblers, bowerbirds, which of course build those amazing bower structures. You've probably seen them on David Attenborough. And all of these birds, believe it or not, are more closely related to crows than many other kinds of birds. And this Australian birds represent a great example of what we call convergence. We see a lot of the same habits of birds in Australia as we do in birds in North America, like the Carolina wren that's nesting in my backyard in Concord. Looks just like this fairy wren. It cocks its tail in the same way, but it's completely unrelated. And so we see birds evolving into the same niche over and over again. In the next slide, I just want to encourage you to come visit the Harvard Museum of Natural History. It's one of the great institutions of this great city. And you'll be able to learn all about the evolution of birds there. So thank you very much, and let's look forward to the film.